Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here on this stormy night. Thanks, everybody on the Zoom who is here. I hope you're feeling very cozy and enjoying a nice cup of something. I'm going to read from the paper because I'm very excited and nervous. So the plan for this evening is a pretty standard one for a book launch, even though the book is already more than a year old. And we're going to have some thoughtful comments from three of my colleagues. And we're going to, who are going to talk about my book, Affiliated Identities in Jewish American Literature, that came out in Bloomsbury Academic in 2020. And we'll have a musical interlude from Nadavi Noked. This book is about how writers present themselves as connected to other writers. They do this in order to show who they are, specifically their identity as Americans and Jews, and Jewish Americans specifically. There's also sections about how Israeli writers relate to American writers in similar ways. I think maybe that section is going to get a little more focus this evening. So this evening sort of performs the same thing that I'm talking about in the book, where I connect myself to other people in order to show who I am. And the people I invited really are not just people I want to know what they think about my book, but people I feel are connected to my book and are part of its history. So first, I really hope you enjoy the evening. And second, I really hope that I'm not so overwhelmed that I can enjoy the evening as well. Writing a book is a long journey, as the cliche goes. A first academic book is even a longer journey. If I can place one moment of birth or its inception was in Emily Budick's seminar on Jewish and African American literature and Jews and Black people in contact. And there, it wasn't even on the syllabus. She just described the plot of The Ghostwriter by Philip Roth. And in that book, the protagonist, a young author, imagines or thinks that he has a chance to meet Anne Frank and maybe even marry her. Just thinking about what this kind of encounter could mean to an American Jew, to a young author, sent me on the way that ended up with this book. Emily died in 2016, just as I was really starting to work on the book. And even though this is a celebration, I'm also thinking about her this evening. Yes, that's all I'm going to say about that. There are other moments of how the book started, and I'll mention them in the evening, maybe at least one. But if I look as far back as I can, if I don't include high school, then that's the moment. So the speaker, as is usual, the speakers sent me short bios. But I gave them my own twist because I have the responsibility of presenting the speakers. First on will be Baraah Abed Elhai. She's a PhD candidate at Bar-Ilan University in the English department. And she's working on Anglophone Palestinian writers, writings by women authors. Baraah was one of the first people to read the book after it was published. So a lot of people read parts of the book before it was published, but she was the first one I could say, here's a book, I wrote it. because she was my teaching assistant at the time it came out. So we were in close contact through Zoom. Of course, it was the height of Corona lockdowns. And back then, she really challenged me on a number of things in the book, but I don't know, maybe it was the Corona, or that the book was so fresh, I wasn't really open to hearing anything good or bad about the book. So I really hope that today I am a little more attentive. Thank you. So please welcome Baraah.
Thank you, David. It is my pleasure and honor to participate in this event, celebrating the launch of David's affiliated identities in Jewish American literature. I want to begin this talk about this book by drawing attention to two of the important observations David makes to develop and emphasize his thesis. The first is the metaphor of the candy floss, which the sociologist Irving Goffman presents in his book, Stigma. Goffman, David tells us, explains that, quote, personal identity has to do with the assumption that the individual can be differentiated from all others, and that around this means of differentiation, a single continuous record of social facts can be attached, entangled, like candy floss, becoming then the sticky substance to which still other biographical facts can be attached, end quote. David then clarifies that while, I quote David here, public identity is that portion of Goffman's candy floss that is available to those who are not in everyday contact with a public figure, it also leaves room for the possibility that the identity displayed to the public also represents personal identity, and that personal and everyday identifications are often also resources when authors perform publicly, end quote. The second observation is manifest in a quote David presents from Nicole Krauss's dedication page of her novel, The History of Love, where she thanks her grandparents for teaching her that books are the opposite of disappearing. Krauss, according to David, seems to believe that, quote, fiction is a way to connect to others so they can see you and you are able to see them, end of quote. Many of us attest to the truthfulness of this. I, for one, share David's view of literature as a social activity, and I believe, as he does, that books are agents of human connection and self-expression. We are then entitled to view David's affiliated identities in Jewish American literature in the same light of both observations. His is a negation of invisibility and a taste of his own candy floss, which entangles strings of David's personal and public identity. Indeed, David's unique voice comes through powerfully, and my copy of the book confirms that. While leafing through the pages of the book in preparation for this talk, I counted 44 words expressing excitement, admiration, agreement, and applause. Thus, you will find the words, wow, interesting, beautiful, beautifully said, and even perfect, all followed by exclamation points scripted in the margins of the book's pages. And I urge you, David, to write another book. I know that it's a hard journey, but I'm doing this right now publicly in front of everyone. I think that David presents a budding thesis, one which carries potential for growth in diverse ways. It especially opens vistas of thought for those interested in the studies of identity politics, myself included. In an appealing manner to me, David showcases how authors transcend politics imposed on their identities by virtue of birth, place, and ethnicity. Adopting a post-essentialist and inclusive approach to examining this transcendence, David aligns himself with Benjamin Schreier in challenging what David tells us Schreier calls identitarianism. Instead of extracting Jewishness of text from that of its author, David's approach quote, allows one to legitimately include any writing that seems to be concerned with producing and interrogating Jewishness, even if its writer is not ethnically Jewish, end of quote. That brings us to Sayyid Kashua, who, according to David, is a case in point. Examining David's book for the first time, chapter 7, entitled Kashua's Complaint to Palestinian Writer Meets Roth, caught my eye. So it was the first chapter I read after the introduction. Kashua and I come from Tira. We are both Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel. And as for filial ties, we are connected. While my first and second readings of this chapter acknowledge Kashua's affiliation with Philip Roth and Jewishness, as presented by David, my second reading makes more discernible the source of uneasiness that the first reading yielded. In an email to David about chapter 7, I shared the opening paragraph of Hanan Cheber's book, Producing the Modern Hebrew Canon, Nation Building and Minority Discourse. The paragraph reads thus. Amos Oz once questioned about the critical acclaim that greeted Anton Shammas's Arabesques. Did Oz ask the interviewer, so somebody's interviewing Amos Oz, and he asks him, does he consider the publication of this novel, written in Hebrew by an Israeli Arab, to be a turning point in Israeli society? Oz responded, I think of this as a triumph, not necessarily for Israeli society, but for the Hebrew language. If the Hebrew language is becoming attractive enough for a non-Jewish Israeli to write in it, then we have arrived. End of quote. That's the end of the paragraph, the opening paragraph of Hanan Cheber's book. It is not my purpose to analyze Oz's response here, but I want to point out the reason it came up after my first reading and why, after the second, it continues to resonate. One of the many issues embedded in Oz's response is hegemony of Israeli Jewish majority over Israeli Arab minority. These power relations that David touches upon in this chapter problematize Kashua's affiliation with Roth. Namely, in performing his affiliative act with Roth, foregrounded in similarities and differences between the two, Kashua downplays those power relations and turns a blind eye to the way they function in his writings. And that, I think, tinges this affiliation with certain shadiness. David illustrates that in contrasting himself with Roth, Kashua, in one of his columns, points out that, quote, Roth wrote English, his mother tongue, and the language of the American Jews he depicts in his book. He wrote about them for them, end of quote. He is referring here to Portnoy's complaint. Kashua, on the other hand, states that he uses the language of the enemy, and that is Kashua's term, to write about Arabs for the enemy, that is the Israeli Jewish audience. I'm using these words to follow Kashua's argument here. While David brings our attention to Kashua's disingenuousness about Roth's use of English and his actual position in the United States, presuming both to be unproblematic, I think that Kashua is similarly disingenuous about his use of Hebrew. David informs us that the term, and this is a quote from David's book, David informs us that the term enemy's language is ironic because it is, despite the conflict, also Kashua's. It is meant to be taken as an echo of his Palestinian critics who might wish to ignore or suspect him simply for this choice, end of quote. David also maintains that since Kashua's formal education was in Hebrew, he is somewhat stuck with this language. While these considerations absolve Kashua for writing in Hebrew, for he doesn't do so out of choice, they also justify the claim of critics such as Hamad Hamza Ghanaim, whom David quotes saying that Kashua engages in, quote, spiritual examination of himself and the other in completely Israeli terms, end of quote. As opposed to some Arab intellectuals I don't find Hebrew writing by Arab authors strange and incomprehensible, but it seems to me that Kashur lacks the means to make Hebrew his own. He reads to many as an Arab passing for an Israeli Jew, writing about Israeli Arabs, and therein lies the problem. Maybe Kashur needs to re-affiliate in order to affiliate. Only then will he be able to forge an authorial identity with more grounded networks of affiliation, not only with Roth, but with many others. I want to end this talk by a reference to David's less trodden path, that is the path of the diasporic Jew, which provides those who tread it with double consciousness, thereby allowing them, as David tells us, quote, to see the self-contradiction that afflicts or empowers minority groups, end of quote. For David, and here I'm using David's words again, reading Jewish American literature, a literature of a minority group that is nonetheless now part of the white hegemony, gives access to some of this diasporic double conscious thinking, end of quote. Hereby, I take this opportunity to join David in his aspiration to attain the state of diasporic Jewishness. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, Nir Evron. Nir Evron is the chair of the English department at Tel Aviv University. He's the author of The Blossom Which We Are, the novel and the transience of cultural worlds that also came out in 2020. So like a brother to my book. They'll go to kindergarten together. Among his other recent publications are articles about Edith Wharton, the history of American regionalism, and the crisis of humanities, and Hannah Arendt. I've known Nir for almost 20 years, can you believe it? We've worked together on a number of projects and had many memorable conversations. One of them connects directly to Baraah's comments because we were on a ride. He gave me a ride from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, like many times. And he said, you know, I know you like Philip Roth. Did you see that column by Said Kashua? I said, no, I have not. I'll go and check it out. And I did. That was an idea for a lecture that became an article that was another beginning to this book. So I'm really, really curious what Nir has to say. So please welcome Nir.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, David, for that kind introduction. And it really is a delight to have a chance to celebrate the publication of this book. As David mentioned, we've known each other for quite a few years now. And I too remember all sorts of discussions we had over the years about living and dead authors, about how authors position themselves in their social networks, and a lot about Philip Roth. Having read closely affiliated Identities, I can report that the book's prolonged gestation period really paid off. The authority and directness with which David lays out his arguments and case studies really attest to the time he spent weighing these ideas and considering objections and testing out hypotheses. And this intellectual labor is evident on every page of this book. Baraah, I think, shares my sentiment here, and no serious reader of affiliated identities will miss it. So in the spirit of full disclosure, I should say that I'm not a scholar of Jewish American literature, and I'm not even a particularly avid reader of Jewish American fiction. So I won't be talking about David's contribution to this particular field. Instead, I want to try to explain what I find so fresh and invigorating about the way David looks at texts and their contexts. Affiliated Identities is not just a study of Jewish American literature. It's also a considered argument about how writers of all kinds position themselves in cultural space. And this theoretical dimension of the book, I suspect, will prove to be one of its most influential aspects. So I want to spend my short time here explaining why that is. So we all know that novels can do all sorts of tricks. They use various plot devices to generate suspense and to entertain us. They can transport us to unfamiliar locales or make places that we thought we knew well seem strange or peculiar to us. They acquaint us with new types of people and sometimes compel us to recognize aspects of ourselves in them. They can advance certain political agendas, or conversely, they can recommend quietism by demonstrating the futility of politics. But novels have another less glamorous but equally important function. They serve as sites in which authors engage in public relations, carefully crafting their social identities by affiliating themselves to other writers, living, dead, or sometimes imagined. In other words, writers often use their stories to position themselves within a selected network of peers in an effort to manage their image and control how their books are read. So when Philip Roth has his alter ego, Nathan Zuckerman, affiliates Nathan Zuckerman with Anne Frank in The Ghostwriter, or when Ernest Hemingway, for that matter, in characteristic aggressive fashion, has the characters of The Sun Also Rises poke fun at the masculinity of Henry James or the relevance of someone like H.L. Mencken. They are, amongst other things, attempting to define their own writerly identities by juxtaposing them to the public identities of other writers. And we sometimes, perhaps intuitively, think that this labor is the stuff of book tours and press interviews and autobiographies. But as David very compellingly shows us, this also takes place on the page. Now, the author's desire to project a certain self-image through association with other writers is eagerly seized upon by his or her readers. And this, I think, is another key insight of David's book, namely that one of the motivations, and it's one of those things that once, I remember you said to me once, and it struck me as so patently obvious, although it's not as frequently discussed as it should be, right? That one of the reasons that we read is to acquaint ourselves with the personality or with the persona that we take to reside somehow beyond the words, right? In other words, we don't just read for the plot. We don't just read for aesthetic pleasure or for wisdom, right? We read to make acquaintances. And here too, the association with other writers is crucial. And to better understand this point, David invites us to think about what happens when we meet a new person, say at a party, right? One of the first things we usually do is to seek out mutual acquaintances, right? This information, David writes, and I quote from the book, not only provides fodder for small talk, but also helps us understand our interlocutor's identity. In other words, we need to place the person in some kind of social context to relate her somehow to people we know or think we know before we feel confident that we know who we're dealing with. David puts it very well when he says, our networks make us readable. Of course, no amount of small talk, or for that matter, no amount of reading in Ernest Hemingway or Philip Roth is ever going to get us acquainted with the real Philip Roth or the real Ernest Hemingway. Human beings are not transparent to themselves, let alone transparent to others. What becomes readable when we trace the network of associations that a writer weaves around herself is ultimately a kind of cultural construct, a narrative of self that she is trying to create by linking her narrated identity to other such identities. So to put this in simple terms, authors, as David sees them, are very real people who, like all real people, are very invested in fictionalizing themselves. All this is to say that writing literature for David is an intensely social activity. It's social not merely in the banal sense that it takes place in a shared language or deals with matters of public concern. Writing is social much in the same way as a political career is social. Both involve networking, image management, affiliation with powerful actors in the field, and so on and so forth. And readers, in turn, use the networks that writers lay out for them in order to get a sense of who the person or who the identity of the person or persona, right, behind the text, as well as to gauge the meaning and value of what they're reading. And think of it, we know this, as those of us who are students of literature know this very well. We never or very rarely encounter a text or a writer in the abstract, right? We typically read text through a certain web of associations that we are either provided with or construct ourselves. So we read Henry James through and with figures like Joseph Conrad and Edith Wharton, right? We read Willa Cather through and with Sarah Orna Jewett and other American regionalists. We read Nicole Krauss through and with Jonathan Safran Foer and Nathan Englander, right? And so on and so forth. And this is a fact that academic writers know very well. We constantly cite other academics' work, not just in order to draw on their research and findings, but also as a way of positioning ourselves within a certain conversation. And that conversation in turn becomes the standard by which our work is evaluated by editors, by peers, by readers, and so on, right? Writers of fiction, David shows us, do much the same thing, only more dishonestly, right? So they too establish links between their public identities and those of their peers, but they do so through intertextual allusion and dramatized encounters rather than by citing and quoting one another. Now, anyone who knows anything about the life of Charles Dickens or Virginia Woolf or Amos Oz or really any professional writer you can think of knows that branding and self-promotion have always played a big part of the professional author's career. Literary works, whether we like it or not, are manufactured commodities whose producers must vie for market share in a very competitive environment. And this is especially true of the novel, which is a popular form that appears hand in hand with the emergence of free markets and the rise of the middle class. So the struggle for attention, for prestige, and of course for financial compensation has been a fact of life for writers since as far back as the 18th century. And the need to establish one's brand by setting it against competing brands or affiliating one's brand with other brands has been around forever. And literary historians have been exploring these aspects of literary production for decades. In the course of the last 20 years or so, with the introduction of big data technology to the humanities, the sociology of literature became one of the most dynamic corners of literary studies. So now, using specially tailored algorithms and vast data sets that can include thousands of literary works, researchers are able to trace very intricate networks of associations and relationships between authors and between texts and between genres in ways that were never possible before. A computer, of course, can do what no critic, no matter how well read she is, could ever hope to accomplish on this front. So all this is to say that the sociological approach that David recommends in his book, as well as his use of the metaphor of the network, right, it is very much in vogue. So does this mean that affiliated identities is but a wave on this great tide of sociology of literature, or does it put something genuinely new on the table? So on the one hand, yes, David's book is very much in sync with the recent sociological turn in literary studies. And his aim, he says this quite openly in the introduction, is not to provide another reading of Exit Ghost or another reading of Krauss's The History of Love. Instead, he's interested in how these novels partake in the production of Roth's and Krauss's public identities. So affiliated identities participates in this sense in the current drift away from interpretation and towards social analysis. But on the other hand, David's book is distinguished from many contemporary sociologies of literature in that it locates the sociological dimension within the literary works themselves. So the work of identity construction, which is at the heart of David's project, is not extraneous to the fictional world. It takes place within it, shaping it in particular ways. And in many cases, writers make the drama of affiliation itself part of the story. And this is why, of course, why David opens with the example of the ghostwriter. Roth's novel is an extreme example of a narrative that is explicitly organized around the themes of affiliation and identity construction. In other words, it's a book that's about what it performs, and it performs what it's about. But what I find uniquely valuable about David's book is its achieved synthesis between seemingly antagonistic approaches. And I can speak for, I made extensive comments at the margins of the book, and I can only briefly reference what I mean by that. So affiliated identities is a sociological study of literature that also engages in sustained close readings of fictional texts. It firmly reinstates the figure of the author in literary and historical analysis, but it does so without becoming romantic about the author. It sort of circumvents Roland Barthes in a very subtle way, in my view. It makes a case for the distinctiveness of literary texts, but links them in instructive ways to other non-artistic forms of identity creation and identity maintenance. And it does all this theoretical heavy lifting in a clear and candid and immediately accessible style that is a joy to read. David, as he mentioned in his opening remarks, dedicated his book to his late and our late teacher, Emily Budek, who passed away in 2016. I'm sure Emily would have been very proud to be affiliated with this book and with its author, as am I. Congratulations, David, a fantastic book.
Great, thank you for this. Okay, so now I think we deserve a musical break. I'm really happy to invite Nadavi Noked, who's a poet and translator, a teacher, and a graduate of Beit Bell as well. He published Latzut B'Chashefa, a book of poems last year. A lot of books are going to the kindergarten together. He's also, I invited Nadav and I told him he's the only one who can do this job because he has, how would you call it, a hobby, a tendency to translate American or international songs into Hebrew and vice versa. So I thought that the only fitting break for us would be Hebrew translations of Jewish American songs. And Nadav is also going to explain a little bit, so welcome, Nadav.
First of all, there is an issue of cameras. Okay, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Translation for me started as a guerrilla hobby. I just, oh, this looks interesting. Let's see what it would sound like and look like in Hebrew. And as a person who can hold a guitar, musician is maybe too far-fetched, but I tried to combine my two loves, words and music, and make sure that the translations are as musical as they can be. All the musical devices you can think that exist in a text, I try to employ them when I help a poem or a song cross, say, the pond, or a sea, or cross even a river. And yeah, so this was a phone call, a funny phone call that let's see my repertoire, who's Jewish now. And no, with Tom Waits, he was crossed off, Tori Amos crossed off, and we picked two, and now I'm very eager to take my guitar. But before I do that, this is actually my first time here in Beit Bell since the first lockdown, and I have a bachelor's degree from one university and a master's from another, but I'm a Hasava student. So essentially, Beit Bell is my real alma mater as a teacher. So I'm very thankful for the opportunity to visit and play. All this excitement. Just 1 second. So the first one is by Kohen Gadol, Leonard Cohen, Sisters of Mercy. It has been actually translated by two others, but I think this is the first sung translation. ואותי ניחמו ואת השיר לי נתנו, מקווה שתפגוש אותם כי מסעותיך ערכו, אתה שנוטש כל דבר בו עבדה שליטתך, זה מתחיל בביתך וחודר לעמקי נשמתך, כן הייתי נעוץ במקום בו אתה מתנדנד, ברגעי הקדושה בדידותך מעידה על החטא, הן שכבו לצידי, התוודעתי בכל בפניהן, הן נגעו בעיניי ואני בשולי בגדיהן, עם חייך כמלים כאלה שנכמש עם הסתיו, הן יתנו אהבה חיננית כגבעול מלופף, בעוזרי הן עוד נענו, אולי ייפגשו במהרה, אל תדליק את האור, את כתובתם באור סהר תקרא, אני לא אקנה אם אשמע שהמתיקו לילך, אהבנו אחרת וזאת תהיה בחירתך, אהבנו אחרת וזאת תהיה בחירתך. Thank you very much. By the way, I steal all the time from the writers, the poets and the lyrics writer I translate, because I have this to and through translation. I translate from English to Hebrew and from Hebrew to English. So, for instance, when I translate Idan Reichel, I touch the dew on their hem So I took some of these formations and ideas to make the Profundis Mimamakim work in English, actually English and Latin. Now for the next one, by the way, I had the privilege of performing this song when he was still alive with Ari Gorali. And now for a different translation that I wrote after Lou Reed passed away, another kosher Jew. Yeah? Man of good fortune, man of good fortune. They often cause empires to fall, while men of poor beginnings often can't do anything at all. In Hebrew, I looked for something that would, I would say, express the good fortune, and not really mazal, but a lot of money, old money. And I came up with Yaldei Shamenet, juxtaposed with Yaldei Tlush HaMaskoret, the guys who are just waiting for the paycheck at the end of the month. So that requires this. ילדי שמנת, לרוב גורמים לאימפריות ליפול. ילדי תלוש המשכורת, נוטים להיות חסרי יכולת בכל. בין עשירים ממתין למות האב, העני שוטט דמעותיו. מעניין לי את הדחול. ילדי שמנת, בדרך כלל לא עושים שום דבר. ילדי תלוש המשכורת, ינסו כל מה שאפשר. בליבם הם נלחמים כמו גברים, להראות שהם יכולים. להם אין אבא ששופך מזומנים. ילדי שמנת, לרוב גורמים לאימפריות ליפול. ילדי תלוש המשכורת, נוטים להיות חסרי יכולת בכל. כסף מייצר עוד כסף ברור, מינוף תספורת אותו הסיפור. מבחינתי הכל נראה אחור. ילדי שמנת, ילדי תלוש המשכורת, את חייהם יקדישו לתשוקתם. כל מנעמי החיים הטובים לומדים את הכסף וגם את החיים. אבל בחייאת תצאו מהוורידים.
Thank you so much, Nadavi. I hoped I would have a break of being moved, but I'm really moved by the songs. And I'm not sure you know this, but I actually quote Lou Reed in the book as somebody who mentions another writer. And my pages are over there. So I want to introduce Shai Biderman. He has the role of the greetings. Usually greetings come at first, but he made a special effort to come from another conference where he was all day. So he gets to greet in the middle, which is, I think, typical of any event that I organized. Shai is the head of the research authority at Beit Bell. That's like the hat that he has for as the greeter. He also teaches here and at Tel Aviv University. He works and teaches in the fields of film, philosophy of film, visual culture, and literature. Beyond his many articles in these fields, he edited 3 books, Kafka and the Moving Image, The Philosophy of David Lynch, and Plato and the Moving Image. I told you that I feel connected to everybody. Some people for 20 or here I've known for 20 years. Shai, I really only got to know recently, and partly thanks to inviting him to this evening. So I'm really happy to welcome Shai.
Some for 20 years, some for 20 minutes, but it's the quality of encounter which counts. Normally greeting comes in the beginning, as David just said, but the reason for my delay today has to do with something which has also to do with David, and for the reason that I'm going to neglect my prepared notes. Okay. Every window that shuts off, another one opens up. And this is also the reason why I'm going to neglect my notes and pre-prepared greetings, and switch in a moment to a quick note in Hebrew, if only because the topic that connects me to David, despite the 20 minutes of that we had together, is too close to my heart in order to miss anything. And it also has to do with the reason for which I had to excuse myself before. So first and foremost, the part in English has to do with the topic of David's book as well as its quality. I had the immense pleasure of getting acquainted with David and with the book. The topic is very close to my, very much close to my heart. The topic of identity, the topic of Jewish identity, and most importantly, or most specifically, the topic of Jewish identity as being embraced and being developed and dynamically open up in literature and other cultural texts. In my case, the affinity of Jewish identity to film and film culture, very much that of any form of brotherhood you wish to think of, whether it's the Marx brothers or the Coen brothers, or any other family affiliation, is the part where I get personally connected to the book, and the argument that David raises is fantastically constructed, and as Nir mentioned before, has a lot of not only potential but depth of.
I don't want to start a fight, but Philip Roth really, really hated Woody Allen. Really. Okay. Our last speaker is going to speak in Hebrew, is Matan Hermoni. He teaches Hebrew literature and creative writing at the Open University, where we were briefly colleagues. but he's better known as a novelist. His fiction books include the Hebrew Publishing Company and Spielvogel, which was the subject of a section in my book. So you can really imagine how curious I am to see what he made of what I made of his writing about American writers. So it's going to get convoluted. So please welcome Matan.
טוב, דוד, מזל טוב, ותודה שהזמנת אותי. זו הזדמנות מצוינת לדבר על כמה דברים שהספר שלך באמת נוגע בהם. קודם כל נלך לדבר בעברית, משהו רדיקלי, ממש, כן? כי הספר שלך נוגע דווקא הפריזמה הזאת של פיליפ רוס, של ההסתכלות על ספרות ישראלית או ספרות עברית, דרך פיליפ רוס, דרך האפיליאשן שלו, כן, הדרך, ואני מאוד שמח שאתה הכנסת פה את העניין הזה של אפיליאשן. אני כמעט חושב שזה מונח שיכול לבוא במקום אינטרטקסטואליות שכבר קצת נעשה משומש מדי, כי הוא לא עובד על ניואנסים, ובעניין הזה של אפיליאשנס יש הרבה מאוד ניואנסים שמפספסים לדעתי בהסתכלויות תיאורטיות אחרות, ויש לי הרבה מה להגיד על זה, אבל באתי בכובע הסופר דווקא, ואני רוצה להגיד כמה דברים על איך שהסתכלת, אמרת שזה, על איך שאני הסתכלתי על אולי משהו שאני עשיתי דרך זה נקרא אמור אדבר בעברית, אבל having said that, מה שנקרא בעברית צחה, אני רוצה לקרוא פסקה מהספר, עמוד 47, שמבחינתי בהרבה מאוד עניינים, לא פסקה, אני הולך לקרוא משפט, שמבחינתי בהרבה מאוד עניינים, יותר נכון, נגע בהרבה מאוד נקודות שאני רוצה אחר כך לגעת בהן בצורה מעט אולי טיפה אחרת. אז אתה כותב בעמוד 47 ככה. A character's vocation as an author, ושימו לב פה למילה author, כן? אני הולך ניתוח שלך עכשיו, כן? Seems to encourage readers to conflate and confuse authors for character, שזה עניין שהוא מאוד מאוד חשוב, גם במחשבה על ספרות עברית, כן? ומי המצאת מנדלה מוכר ספרים, זה אחד המאמרים הטובים של דן מירון, שגם פותח איזשהו שיח היסטורי בעניין של הדמויות ודמות הסופר. אני אגיד על זה אחר כך עוד כמה דברים. First, the situation itself conveys that whoever wrote the text is a writer. גם בספרות העברית, כמו שנראה אחר כך. Even if we know nothing about them, we can be sure that the text was written by someone who is having written the text, a writer. אוקיי? ונעצור עם באמת משפט אחד, שני משפט. שיש כאן שמבחינתי מאוד מאוד מהותיים. אז אני רוצה להתמקד בפסקה הזאת, זאת אומרת, סליחה? אני רוצה להתמקד בפסקה הזאת ולעבור דרכה אל הניתוח של המכלול שלי בעצם ככותב, דרך הפריזמה שדוד בעצם הציג כאן, של פיליפ רוס. כמובן אני לא בא לבקר את הספר, אני חושב שזה ספר מעולה שקראתי בזמן קצר, מכריכה לכריכה, והוא נוגע בהמון נקודות למחשבה, ואני בשונה ממה שמו, I came to praise את הספר, not to bury it כמובן, כן? אז אני רוצה לדבר על הנחת היסוד הזאת של הדמות, של הסופר כדמות, כן? ולדבר גם על הווריאנט הארץ ישראלי שהתפתח לווריאנט הישראלי. עכשיו, מה מיוחד ברוט ובעיקר בפורטנוי, שבעצם באיזשהו אופן השם שפילפוגל של הספר הקודם שלי בא ממנו, שהוא מבחינתי איזשהו אפיליישן למה שאני ראיתי כקהילה מדומיינת ממש של סופרים. עכשיו, רוט השפיע המון על הספרות העברית, אני חושב שבעיקר הוא השפיע בקטע של מה לא להיות. אחד הדברים שמאוד הפתיעו אותי זה שאתה לא כותב בכלל על א' ב' יהושע ועמוס עוז, למעט אזכור בודד של כל אחד מהם בספר. גרוסמן, שאני באמת חושב שהוא לקח הרבה דברים תמטיים, הרבה כמעט טכניקות, כן, הוא בעצם מהצד השני, 180 מעלות ממה שפיליפ רוט מייצג מבחינתי, וסעד קשוע כמובן הוא דוגמה מאוד מעניינת, הוא משחק על ידי, וזה מעניין איך שאתה מציג את זה כמי שלוקח אלמנטים תמטיים ושותל אותם בתוך הפרוזה שלו, שהיא כבר שונה לגמרי. בתור סופר שכותב עברית ובאיזשהו אופן גם חוקר את העברית, אני ראיתי לעצמי איזושהי חובה כשאני ניגש בתור סופר להתעסק בעניינים של פיליפ רוט. חשבתי על זה אתמול כשהכנתי את ההרצאה, חשבתי שבעצם יש לי כאן איזושהי אחריות אחרת משל סעד קשוע, זאת אומרת יש שבאמת משתמש בתמות ובתחושת הפרנויה שרוט יכול נותן באיזשהו אופן תמטי, תמיד יש צורות איזושהי פרנויה, אבל אני מרגיש שהאחריות שלי ככותב עברית שזאת שפת אימו ובא דווקא ללמוד את השפות האחרות כדי לחבר אותם אל העברית, אבל אני מרגיש שהאפיליישן שלי הוא אחר. אוקיי, ניסיתי לחפש מאיפה זה לקוח, זה משהו שקראתי ולא הצלחתי להיזכר, הלכתי ושאלתי מומחים גדולים, גם הם נתנו לי כל מיני גרסאות אחרות, אז הסיפור חסידי שנתקלתי בו איפשהו, והוא הולך ככה, חסיד ומתנגד נפגשו והם תוהים מאיפה משהו הרבי, לא משנה, הרבי, החסיד אומר לליטאי, מאיפה אתה יודע את הדבר הזה והזה, אז הוא אומר, הרבי שלי שמע מהרבי של ההוא ששמע מזה, שלמד מהוא, ששמע מהוא, שלמד את זה מפי רבי שמעון בר יוחאי, כן? אז החסיד אומר לו, והרבי שלי למד את זה מאותו מקום ששמעון אשר רשב"י למד, ששמעון בר יוחאי למד. אז אני לא רוצה להתעלות באילנות, או להתעלות באילנות גבוהים, אבל כן להתייחס אליהם. זאת אומרת, וזה עניין, דווקא הבחירה ב-Man of Good Fortune של לו ריד, כי אני חושב שאת ברלין של לו ריד שמעתי באותה השנה שבה קראתי בפעם הראשונה את מה מעיק על פורטנוי. ולקח לי זמן להבין מה כל כך משך אותי בספר הזה. עכשיו, אני זוכר בעיקר את הכאב בטן מהצחוק. כשהגעתי לסצנות, זה אפילו לא עננות, כאילו נורא קשה לתרגם את זה בתרגום החדש, קראו לזה ככה וככה, אבל שום דבר לא משתווה ל-wacking off, כן? שישר בגדול באותיות של קידוש לבנה בפרק השני של מה מעיק על פורטנוי. עכשיו, אבל מה הסיטואציה הנרטיבית? אוקיי? מיהו שפילפוגל בעצם של פורטנוי? שפילפוגל הוא הפסיכיאטר, אוקיי? פורטנוי, או יותר נכון, פיליפ רוט מתקשר אל הנרציה היהודית, המונולוג מתוך מצוקה, כן? שמי זאת ינטה התרנגולנית של שלום עליכם. היא באה ומספרת לרב מתוך מצוקה, כן, נושאת מונולוג, מה עושה בעצם טוביה החולב. הוא פוגש את הסופר, הוא פוגש את שלום עליכם, פעם ב10 שנים, פעם ב4 שנים, תופס אותו בשרוול החולצה ומספר לו את הסיפור. בשיעור מאוד יפה שנתן אברהם נוברשטרן לפני לא מעט שנים כבר על ספרות יידיש, הוא דן בשיר י' פרץ של מוישה לייב הלפרן. השיר י' פרץ של הלפרן זה נסיעה ברכבת שנוסע המשורר, והוא רואה שם בחור סיני, והוא רק חושב על זה שבאותו יום י' פרץ מת, ובעצם הוא שם לב שאין לו למי להגיד את זה. עכשיו, אתה חושב על רכבת, אתה חושב על סיפורים, אתה חושב על סיפורי הרכבת של שלום עליכם, ששם זה היה העניין. אדם יושב ומספר סיפור למי שנקלע לשבת לידו. החוויה בניו יורק, החוויה של הניכור הייתה מזה שכבר אין עם מי לדבר, אתה יושב בסאבווי בניו יורק, אתה לא שומע כלום. את חוש השמיעה מחליף החוש הוויזואלי. עד כאן אברהם נוברשטרן, ואז שמתי לב למשהו מעניין בפורטנוי, שזה לא מאפיין את כל הנרציות של פיליפ רוט, אבל זה אותי לפחות תפסה בצורה מאוד חזקה. הוא יושב אצל פסיכיאטר מהסיבה, לא בגלל שהוא חלילה דפוק, כן, וצריך לתקן, אף אחד פה לא היה אצל פסיכיאטר, אנחנו הרי יודעים שרק משוגעים הולכים לפסיכיאטרים, נכון? אני צוחק, תזכרו שהוא מפרסם את הספר בזמן שהפסיכואנליזה על השם מאוד רע במעגלים הספרותיים של ניו יורק, בעיקר עם סלינג'ר וכל מה שהוא כותב על כל הדמויות ש-were analyzed to death, מי שזוכר את הזה. יש לו affiliation לסלינג'ר. ב-My Life as a Man הוא יוצא עם בחורה בשם פרני גלאס, אם אני לא טועה. נכון, הוא יוצא גם עם מישהי בשם שחקנית צעירה וקצת פרחה בשם דולוריס הייז, כן? שגם נותן לנו את ה-affiliation שלו בין הסופרים האמריקאים עם המצח הגבוה ובארצות הברית באותו זמן. כן? אבל מהצד השני, יש לו את הצורך הנרטיבי בתור יהודי לשאת מונולוג של מצוקה. איפה אפשר לשאת מונולוג כזה בתחילת שנות ה-60? בתוך הניכור הניו יורקי, רק על ספת הפסיכיאטר, אוקיי? וכאן אני חוזר למילה, the character's vocation as an author, כי אם יש משהו שאתה מוותר עליו על ספת הפסיכיאטר, זה על ה-authority בתור author. אבל מה שהוא מקבל כאן, כן את היכולת, זה להשתמש בכל המילים הגסות, שהוא רק רוצה לתאר כל דבר לפרטי הפרטים, וכן הלאה והלאה. עכשיו, הסיפור הישראלי, הנרטיב הישראלי, שונה. גם כאן המספר הראשון בסדר היום, זה המספר שהוא הסופר. ברנר התחיל ככה, עשיתי לי פנקס חנייר חלק, ואני אמור לכתוב איזו רשימות וסרטוטים מחיי. ככה הוא פותח בחורף, את הספר שבעצם מתחיל את הספרות העברית המודרנית. עוד דמות של סופרת כותבת, אני כותבת כי אנשים שאהבתי כבר מתו. כן, חנה גונן במיכאל שלי, היום אנחנו יודעים שבאיזשהו אופן זה בעצם מיכאל שלי, יש בו הרבה מן ההסגברה בגוף ראשון אישה, כן, עד כדי כך גוף שלישי, עד כדי כך גוף שלישי, שזה כבר, זאת אומרת, הוא כאילו, עד כדי כך גוף שלישי כל יודע, שהוא כתב מגוף ראשון אישה בתור מספר כל יודע. ככה אני לפחות רואה את זה. כן, אבל יש את דמות המספר שהוא לא מוותר אף פעם על האופרשיפ. המספר הישראלי לא יוותר על העניין הזה אף פעם. איציק מנגר חילק את הספרות היהודית לספרות לירית, פתטית וקומית גרוטסקית. אני לא אכנס לכל הווריאנטים, אבל הוא אמר שהלירית, בעצם מה שהוא כיוון אליו, זה שהלירית פתטית זה הספרות העברית, ומה שהתפתח ממנה, בשעה שהספרות יידיש היא ספרות קומית גרוטסקית, כן? ואנחנו יכולים לראות שהקומי גרוטסקי שאיציק מנגר מתכוון אליו, זה לא כל כך רחוק ממה שבחתין קרא, כן? הז'אנר הרציני מצחיק. אבל הוא לוקח את הסופר הזה, את דמות הסופר, והוא עושה בה שמות. למה? כי הוא נותן לסופר לא לכתוב איפה שהפורטה שלו. נבוקוב הרי הפתיחה של לוליטה זה You can always count on a murder for a fancy prose style. אבל מה קורה לזה עם הבעל ה-fancy prose style ברגע שמושיבים אותו מול הפסיכיאטר? הוא נותן מונולוג, הוא קצת משוגע לחלוטין, כן? והוא יכול בעצם להגיד מה שהוא רוצה. עכשיו אני אדבר קצת על האפיליישן של עצמי, אני אעשה את זה במשך 1.5 דקות בערך. האינסטינקט של קורא בן 17, כאב הבטן מרוב צחוק, ואז באמת התופעה, לא ידעתי עוד להסביר את זה, כן? בטח לא מבחינה תיאורטית, התופעה הפיזיולוגית שקורית לך כשאתה קורא את מה שנקרא הז'אנר הרציני מצחיק, הלסת שלך קצת נשמטת. זאת אומרת, זה האפקט שיוצא, שאתה קורא את כל הספר עם האפקט הפיזי הזה, אוקיי? אבל זה מאפשר לך גם הפנייה אל פיליפ רות, היא גם בעצם איזושהי בקשת רשות. אני גם רוצה לכתוב בצורה גסה, משוחררת, ושעשויה לעצבן הרבה אנשים. זה לא רק אפיליישן מבחינתי, פיליפ רות, וגם איזושהי לגיטימציה. תודה על הספר, הוא היה לי מאוד מעניין, זה פוקח עיניים, תודה שהזמנת אותי לדבר.
Wow. It's, you can't turn off the literary critic. So like, I'm working as I'm listening and as I'm flattered. I'm also working at the same time. So thank you, Matan. Thank you, everybody. I'm just going to say a quick thanks. Thank you, everybody who spoke, who sang, who played, who helped me organize this evening. Thank you, everybody who's here in this stormy night. You said you came through the traffic, but you didn't talk about the wind and the rain, to quote Shakespeare again. I want to thank my family, especially Lilach. It's a cliche for authors to thank their spouses, but Lilach really contributed the most visible part of this book. She drew the cover. She helped me make the invitation. This cover of straps for a tefillin. She didn't only draw it, she convinced me out of a very bad idea, and we worked together on this idea, and it became part of the coda for the whole book. So yeah, just really grateful, and I'll see you around. Thank you for all the Zoom people. I'm sorry if I didn't give you all the attention you deserve. Bye-bye.